Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we are going to be discussing the 2018 novel The Overstory by Richard Powers. So this novel is now going to be the newest novel, the most recent novel that we'll have covered on this podcast. Only 6 years ago, 2018. Obviously, on this podcast, as I've said, I want to focus on classic novels. I want to focus on what I think are great works of literature. And I will say that I believe The Overstory, I believe this novel, is one of the great novels of the 21st century. I'm not going to go so far as to say it's the greatest novel of the 21st century, but it certainly is a masterpiece. And it certainly deserves canonical recognition for what it's accomplished. I think it's Richard Powers' magnum opus, and he is a writer who's written a lot of novels. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018. But of course, these aren't really the markers. Winning a prize is not a reason why something is considered a masterpiece. The reason this novel is a masterpiece, the reason this novel deserves a place in the canon of 21st century and really all American literature is, as I've said before, it does what all great novels do. It is in dialogue with the time period in which it was written. And specifically, it's in dialogue with the idea of environmentalism, with the anxieties that we feel in the 21st century around issues of climate change and what's being done to the planet, and the feeling that the planet will not survive, or, as Richard Powers would argue, is that we won't survive. Because one thing that we'll see in this novel is Powers actually does believe that the planet can and will survive, because he believes the trees are more intelligent than we are and can survive what we can't. So the crisis of climate change for Powers is more about human beings surviving the catastrophe that we've created. Now, this novel speaks to those anxieties about climate change pretty directly and pretty profoundly. In terms of the novel itself, the structure of the novel. So this novel also has, and the other reasons I think it's a masterpiece, obviously the prose style is remarkable, and we're going to look at some incredible stylistic passages in which Powers uses his singular voice to discuss these profound themes. In particular, it's interesting, Powers' novels have often been criticized, especially by a New Yorker critic, James Wood, for being inhuman. There was a very famous essay in which James Wood essentially critiqued Powers' entire oeuvre for being too inhuman. What we'll see when we read some passages from The Overstory is, in this particular novel, that aspect of Powers' voice, the idea that there is something more important than the human, it actually works wonders here because it touches on the theme itself. And so this novel is narrated, it's told from the perspective of 8 different characters, or I suppose 9 different characters. But it's really narrated by this grander voice who speaks through all of these characters and who sometimes kind of takes over the story, especially when he discusses the trees and the significance of the trees. And I think that narrative voice, right, Powers' narrative voice, is very singular and very powerful, partly because it transcends the human, right? He speaks in the voice of nature and the voice of the trees themselves at some points in the novel. So the voice is excellent. That's the prose style is one reason this novel is a masterpiece. More than that, though, is, of course, the structure. So this novel has a very intelligent and sophisticated structure. So first of all, obviously there are 9 point of view characters, 9 protagonists, you could argue, although some are more important than others, and we'll touch on each of them. In terms of the structure of the rest of the novel, though, right, it follows essentially, the novel is structured around the different parts of a tree. So part 1 is titled Roots, and this is the part in which we meet all of our point of view characters, our 9 primary protagonists. Then we have a section titled Trunk, in which the storylines of these protagonists continue, develop, intersect. Then, of course, we have a section titled Crown, in which, so to speak, everything comes to a head, so to speak. Everything comes together, but also the characters branch off in different directions. So the Crown section is also when the characters' paths diverge. And then the final section is Seeds, in which we see the aftermath, the legacy, the consequences of the actions that the characters have taken. So the structure of this novel, 4 parts, each of which corresponds to a section of a tree, very intelligently also, I think, captures the way stories are told, right? It makes perfect sense to tell a story in this way. Roots, trunk, crown, and seeds. It's a wonderful way of structuring a story, and it provides another really interesting way of thinking about story structure more generally. Let's get into the characters, though, and let's get into the structure, and then we'll get into some of the passages. So there are, as I said, 9 primary protagonists in the Overstory. The first protagonist we meet, the first character, Nicholas Hole, he is, I would argue, the most important. I think he's the closest thing we have to a traditional protagonist, right? I'm not saying he's the only traditional protagonist, but as we're going to see, he has a clear arc in the story. He also opens the novel and he closes the novel. And he is an artist, right? He is an artist. In the first section, we sort of meet him and learn how he becomes an artist, essentially. We also, though, and this is important, we see his ancestors and his family. One thing that Powell really wants to emphasize is that the individual is just one part of a greater whole. And so even though when he introduces these 9 characters, it sort of feels like 9 short stories in some way, or 8 short stories. I keep saying 8 and 9 because 2 of the characters, Ray and Dorothy, a married couple, share one story, right? Share one section, but they are 2 distinct characters. With these 9 characters essentially are introduced in what can sort of what feels like 8 effective short stories, each of which could stand on their own. But of course, Powers' point is that they shouldn't stand on their own. One of the big things he emphasizes is the interconnected nature of human beings, but also of human beings to the natural world. And so he's very careful in each of these stories not to glamorize or privilege the individual, the human being. Instead, he presents each of these characters in the context of their families, their lives, the social sort of settings. And Nicholas Hole's introduction very much does that, where we begin with his ancestors on the East Coast who then move to the Midwest. So we also chart Nicholas Hole's family against the backdrop of American history. So we have Nicholas Hole, we have Mimi Ma. She's an engineer, right? And she also is, I think, something like a protagonist because she experiences certain epiphanies towards the end of the novel, right? Her character arc involves experiencing certain key dramatic epiphanies about the nature of the trees. We have Adam Apich, who is a psychologist, and I think his character and the function of his character is really to critique psychology and to critique human nature. Again, Richard Powers is very critical of human beings in this story, and I think Adam Apich's character is a way of doing that. So in addition to Adam Apich, we have Ray Brinkman and Dorothy Kazali. So Ray and Dorothy are interesting. Ray and Dorothy are a married couple, and they do have some connection to the trees. But unlike some of the other characters, they do not become activists. Essentially, the main plot line of the novel, right, is that 5 of these characters, Nicholas, Mimi, Adam, Douglas, and Olivia, all join essentially an eco-terrorist cell and basically try and blow up the logging equipment. That's kind of the primary plot of the novel. The main action, right, that a group of characters take. Now, a handful of these characters, though, are not part of that group of activists, are not part of the eco-terrorists. Ray and Dorothy are not part of that group. Their storyline is pretty distinct, pretty separate from all the others. However, I think the point of their storyline, and it's mainly just a storyline about their dysfunctional marriage, essentially, and sort of the human dramas that they suffer over the course of their lives. I think the point of their storyline is to present a human tragedy, to present kind of a classic human tragedy, human drama, and then to contrast that with the larger drama of environmental destruction. And I think, this is my contention. I think Powers is using Ray and Dorothy's story to lightly critique and satirize traditional novels, traditional stories that focus too much on the human. And there's going to be one passage in particular we'll read in which I think he really clearly makes this argument. So I find the Ray and Dorothy story fascinating because I think Powers is using them to make this complex thematic point about human beings and their petty dramas, in contrast to the much more dramatic and significant story of the planet's destruction. Obviously the big theme to the Overstory, the big thematic tension, and this is something I say in my creative writing classes, you should always present your themes as tension or conflict between two ideas. It's clearly the idea between humans, between the human way of seeing the world and the way a tree experiences the world. We're going to see this theme in one of the opening passages of the novel. But continuing through the list of characters, so after Ray and Dorothy, we have Douglas Pavlicek. So Douglas is a Vietnam War veteran whose life is saved by a tree. And he essentially becomes, an environmental activist, alongside several of the other characters. We have Nilay Mehta. So Nilay is, like Ray and Dorothy, he is not an activist. He is another character who is slightly disconnected from all of the others. His storyline is pretty separate. He becomes paralyzed after falling from a tree. As a result, he becomes a computer programmer. And through Nilay's story, I think Richard Powers is making this connection between technology and the sort of power of technology to visualize this and sort of create this non-human ecosystem, so to speak. I think Nilay's storyline is very interesting. In our analysis today, we're not going to talk too much about Nilay. This is one of the things that, unfortunately, when I was outlining this episode, I had to sort of decide which characters are we going to focus on, because this is such an enormous novel with so many characters, so many storylines that intersect. It's going to be hard to touch on everybody. So instead, I'll focus my analysis on kind of the primary, what I think are the primary protagonists: Nicholas, Olivia, who I haven't talked about yet, Patricia, and then Ray and Dorothy, because I think they're an interesting foil, an interesting contrast. But all of these other characters, they all have an important role to play in this novel, and Powers very intelligently kind of weaves their stories together. So then the other two characters, we have Patricia Westerford. Now, she, I think, is one of the most important characters because she essentially articulates what I believe is Powers' primary point. So she is a scientist who basically makes the argument that trees and plants have a consciousness and that they communicate with one another. And this is essentially the primary point of the novel. Patricia is essentially the one who articulates very clearly the primary scientific idea about the communication between trees. And I think the whole point of this novel is that's what happens, right? When we get to the end, we're going to see that Nicholas Hole, understand, both Nicholas and Mimi come to understand that Patricia is right, that the trees do in fact communicate with one another. And again, it's that idea of humans versus trees, right? As these two contrasting consciousnesses. And the idea of, is the human the only thing that matters? And Patricia is arguing through her scientific research that no, the trees also matter. And then, of course, there is Olivia. So Olivia is another of my favorite characters. So she's basically a college student, and she's presented as pretty frivolous when we first meet her, concerned mostly with kind of ordinary worldly things. The things, honestly, that every college student might be concerned with. Slightly selfish, slightly self-interested. And then she almost dies. She has a near-death experience. She survives the death, but as a result, essentially starts to hear the trees. Essentially starts to hear voices. Basically, she can communicate with the trees. So she develops this almost like prophetic ability, right? This prophetic, mystic ability. And she's really the one who becomes the the kind of mystic and prophet who leads the group of environmental activists. I find her to be maybe one of the most interesting characters because of this mystical and prophetic side. And the way, especially the way she transforms in her storyline. So again, there are 9 characters who make up the primary protagonists of the novel, and Powers basically, alternates between each of their perspectives. I want to start, though, when we look at passages from this novel, I want to start at the beginning, in Nicholas's chapter. Not at the very beginning, though. I want to look at, there's a passage in Nicholas's introductory chapter, which I think articulates very succinctly and very beautifully the key themes of the novel, and in particular this idea of the way a tree experiences the world versus the way a human does. So this is on page 16. So I have the paperback edition. This is on page 16. This is in the first chapter, Nicholas's chapter. And what we're describing here is basically, I believe it's Nicholas's father, right, who takes photos of a tree, of a chestnut tree that was planted outside their house. He takes a photo of the tree every month, and it creates this timeline, basically, of the tree. And Powers has this wonderful passage where he reflects on this stack of photos of the tree over the course of these years. The stack, he's referring here to the stack of photos, the stack grows thicker than any book he has ever tried to read. But each photo in the sheaf shows only that lone tree, shrugging off the staggering emptiness that the man knows so well. The farm is to Frank Jr.'s back each time he opens the lens. The photos hide everything. The 20s that do not roar for the holes, the depression that costs them 200 acres and sends half the family to Chicago, the radio shows that ruin 2 of Frank Jr.'s sons for farming, the whole death in the South Pacific, and the 2 whole guilty survivals, the deers and caterpillars parading through the tractor shed, the barn that burns to the ground one night to the screams of helpless animals, the dozens of joyous weddings, christenings, and graduations, the half-dozen adulteries, the 2 divorces sad enough to silence songbirds, one son's unsuccessful campaign for the state legislature, the lawsuit between cousins, the 3 surprise pregnancies, the protracted whole guerrilla war against the local pastor and half the Lutheran parish, the handiwork of heroin and Agent Orange that comes home with nephews from Nam, the hushed-up incest, the lingering alcoholism, a daughter's elopement with the high school English teacher, the cancers, breast, colon, lung, the heart disease, the degloving of a worker's fist in the grain auger, the car death of a cousin's child on prom night, the countless tons of chemicals with names like Rage, Roundup, and Firestorm, the patented seeds engineered to produce sterile plants, the 50th wedding anniversary in Hawaii and its disastrous aftermath, the dispersal of retirees to Arizona and Texas, the generations of grudge, courage, forbearance, and surprise generosity, everything a human being might call the story happens outside his photos' frames. Inside the frame, through hundreds of revolving seasons, there is only that solo tree, its fissured bark spiraling upward into early middle age, growing at the speed of wood. So I remember when I read this passage for the first time, and I knew even before this book won the Pulitzer Prize, I knew it was a masterpiece. I knew it was something truly magnificent. I remember really, noting this passage, feeling this was a magnificent passage, and partly because when we're starting this book, we don't yet know what the storyline is going to be about. And he begins with, the whole family, and we think, okay, it's our classic family saga, right? Multiple generations, right? Or against the backdrop of American history. That's what we sort of think we're in for. And then he has this surprise passage in which the 20th century basically passes here. The 20s that do not roar, the Depression, right? The death in the South Pacific, alluding to World War II. Later, we have an allusion to Vietnam with Agent Orange. Eventually, we have a reference to kind of what's sometimes called in history books the Green Revolution, right? Anything but green in many cases, right? When we have these chemicals, right, and fertilizers and patented seeds making their way into farms. We see that whole development right? That whole development, all the history of the 20th century and the characters' lives, right? Marriages, divorces, cancers, wedding anniversaries, retirees moving to Arizona and Texas, right? All the stuff that might make up a traditional story, as he says at the end, it all happens outside the frame of the photos. What happens inside the frame? The tree growing. And what is the way, how does he describe the tree growing? Through hundreds of revolving seasons. I think that phrase revolving seasons is important because he's making us aware that for us, the seasons can be quite dramatic and can cause a lot of change for human beings. Lots of things can happen from season to season. But for the tree, the seasons are simply revolving, right? Moving in a circle. That's what revolving means. Because for the tree, there's a cyclical pattern to the seasons, right? A steadiness to the seasons. They revolve. It's not a dramatic straight line moving upward like a human life or downward, right? It is a circle. It is a revolving season. And how does it describe the tree growing? It's fissured bark spiraling upward into early middle age. I like this image of the tree spiraling upward. It's a wonderful image. I mean, it suggests DNA. It suggests a double helix, right? It also suggests this ascension to heaven, this movement upward. It's a beautiful image to describe the way the tree grows. It lifts you as you read it, the sense of the tree spiraling upward, and it's only in early middle age. It's still a relatively young tree, growing at the speed of wood. I love that phrase, the speed of wood, because that's his big thematic idea. He wants us to think at the speed of wood. He does not want us to think from a human perspective. He wants us to think from the perspective of a tree. So he is setting up at the very beginning of his novel, in the very first chapter, the primary thematic conflict between humans and trees, and specifically in the way we experience the world, our consciousness. Human consciousness is all the stuff that happens outside the frame. The divorces, the deaths, all that stuff, right? The cancers, the marriages, all the stuff that happens outside the frame, what we traditionally think of as a story. He is telling us that is not the story. The story is this tree. So he is telling us at the beginning, think at the speed of wood and put yourself in the consciousness of a tree rather than a human being. This is not a story about human beings. So the frame that he describes, right, is the frame of the photos that Frank Jr., right, Nicholas's father, is taking, or I believe he might be Nicholas's grandfather. Basically, the photos that he's taking, but the point is, the frame is also Richard Powers' novel. The novel is also, in a sense, a frame. And he is telling us what is inside this frame. The important stuff that's inside this frame is not the human stuff. Focus on the trees, he's telling us. And it's such a beautiful passage to open it. And again, I think the other thing he's sort of doing there, and the other thing is all of those things that he mentions, the person killed in Vietnam, right? The depression, the roaring 20s that don't roar, the arrival of, mechanized agriculture. Each of those could be a story, right? And in fact, many of those are short stories. It's almost like Richard Powers he's not really satirizing kind of traditional literature, traditional American stories, but he sort of is, he's lightly making fun of the things that we write stories about. Right, we write stories about divorces and marriages and wedding anniversaries and deaths of cancer. These are the things we traditionally write about. We write about people coming back from Vietnam. We write about the human stuff, and sure, it's moving. And I'm not going to pretend it's not moving because we've talked about novels about things like that, and we will in the future, that are very moving. But Powers is kind of challenging us to think, is this the only thing that matters? Are these stories, are these things that he so blithely summarizes away, are these things the things that really matter, or is it something else? Is it the tree that matters? And that's what he wants us to think. That's the consciousness that he wants to put us in at the beginning of this novel. So let's jump ahead a little bit. There's another passage I want to look at now. So jumping kind of to the storyline of Patricia. So I want to talk about Patricia's storyline because she's the one who really identifies this idea that the trees have a consciousness, that the trees can speak to each other. And primarily, her storyline is about how this idea gets her criticized by her scientific colleagues, kind of gets her ostracized from the scientific community. So there are many wonderful passages in Patricia's section where she kind of goes out into the woods and stands in the woods and tries to connect and feel this connection with the trees. Let's look at this one particular passage, which I think is just it's a nice exemplary passage of Powers' style and the way in which he really captures human connection to trees, right? Many of these human characters, in fact, I would say all of these human characters have a profound connection to trees. That is why they are our protagonists. Even Ray and Dorothy, right? The couple whose storyline, as I said, I think is presented as a kind of foil to the others. Even they have a pretty profound connection to nature, which gives their story this meaning. So let's look at page 130. This is Patricia's section. And, the context here is, she's basically out in the woods. On a late fall afternoon, she pulls her ancient beater over to the side of the road, along a stretch of Fish Lake Scenic Byway, on the western edge of the Colorado Plateau, in south-central Utah. She has followed back roads from Las Vegas, capital of clueless sinners, toward Salt Lake, capital of cunning saints. By the way, this is also a very American novel, right? Richard Powers very dramatically conjures up the American landscape, the landscape of our country. This is another reason why I think it's such a great work of American literature of the 21st century, is he really captures what living in America feels like, witnessing this beautiful, vast, natural landscape dwindling, right? This natural wonder that we have taken for granted. She gets out of the car and walks up into the trees on the crest west of the road. Aspens stand in the afternoon sun, spreading along the ridge out of sight. Populus tremuloides. Clouds of gold leaf glint on thin trunks, tinted the palest green. The air is still, but the aspens shake as if in a wind. Aspens alone quake when all others stand in dead calm. Long, flattened leaf stalks twist at the slightest gust, and all around her a million two-toned cadmium mirrors flicker against righteous blue. So there are many beautiful descriptions of nature in this novel, and it makes sense because Powers wants us to feel the dramatic beauty of nature, the dramatic beauty of these trees. And so when he has a chance to describe the trees and describe the flowers and describe nature, he really does an excellent job of indulging in those sensory details. The oracle leaves turn the wind audible. They filter the dry light and fill it with expectation. Trunks run straight and bare, roughed with age at the bottom, then smooth and whitening up to the first branches. Circles of pale green lichen palette spatter them. She stands inside this white-gray room, a pillared foyer to the afterlife. The air shivers in gold, and the ground is littered with windfall and dead ramettes. The ridge smells wide open and sere. The whole atmosphere is as good as a running mountain stream. So this is another feature of a lot of Powers' descriptions of nature. He really makes sure to use active verbs whenever describing the trees. So the oracle leaves turn the wind audible. So in other words, it's not the wind that is rustling through the leaves, which is a traditional description. Instead, he's saying the leaves turn the wind audible. So the leaves are the active ones in the sentence, and the wind is the passive object. The leaves turn the wind audible. It's a wonderful inversion of the classic way we write that description of the leaves rustling in the wind. Instead, he says the leaves are actually turning the wind audible. The leaves are actively making the wind audible, which is such a beautiful way of describing that effect from the point of view of a tree. Right, she also says that the leaves filter the dry light and fill it with expectation. Again, the leaves are the active agents in that sentence. They are filtering the light and they are filling it with expectation. The leaves are not just passive. The trees are not just passive. They are active in this passage, in this sentence. And I love this description of she's standing in the forest, and to her it's like a white-gray room, a pillared foyer to the afterlife. Right? The trees throughout this are constantly described in spiritual and mystical terms. Powers does have his awareness of science, right? There are a lot of scientific facts here, but he does not want to depict nature through the kind of cold objectivity of science. For him, nature is a mystical experience. Nature reminds us of death, teaches us how to die. As he says in so many of these passages, many of these trees are older than the United States itself. And he really emphasizes this long life of the trees as a way of speaking to us, human beings, with our short lives. And for Powers, that mystical experience is important. And that's why this scientist, Patricia Westford, she's a scientist. She is having in this moment a mystical experience as she looks at these trees. If we read the next paragraph here, Patricia Westerford hugs herself and, for no reason, begins to cry. The tree of the Navajo Sun House chant. The tree Hercules turned into a wreath. The one he sacrificed when coming back from hell. The one whose brood leaves protected native hunters from evil. This, the most widely distributed tree in North America, right? She's talking about the aspen here. The most widely distributed tree in North America, with close kin on 3 continents, all at once feels unbearably rare. She has hiked through aspens far north into Canada, the lone hardwood holdout in a latitude monotonous with conifer, has sketched their pale summer shades throughout New England and the upper Midwest, has camped among them on hot, dry outcrops above gushing streams of snowmelt in the Rockies, has found them etched with knowledge-encoded native arborglyphs, has lain on her back with her eyes closed in far southwestern mountains, memorizing the tone of that restless shudder. Picking her way across these fallen branches, she hears it again. No other tree makes this sound. So again, what's important here, right? For Patricia, for the scientist, her relationship to the trees is not just one of science. It is a very personal relationship. She is crying as she thinks about the aspens, which she has such familiarity with, right? She's aware of the sound they make and how it's like no other sound. And again, notice the wide array of places that Patricia describes. For Powers, the North American continent, this novel is set essentially across the North American continent, really across the United States, but he's including here New England, the upper Midwest, Canada, the Rockies, referencing Native Americans. The idea is, America, to Powers, is blessed with these wondrous trees. And it's implicitly he's saying, right, we have been failing to preserve them, right, to preserve these forests. And that's why Patricia is crying here, right? It says she's crying for no reason, but we know that that's a bit ironic. We know the reason she's crying. She's crying because of this mystical identification she's feeling with the aspens and this fear, right, that they will disappear. If we keep reading, the aspens wave in their undetectable breeze, and she begins to see hidden things. High up on one trunk, she reads claw gashes above her head, the cryptic writing of bears. But these slashes are old and rimmed with blackened scars. No bears have crossed these woods in a long time. Tangled roots spill from the banks of a rivulet. She studies them, the exposed edge of a network of underground conduits, conducting water and minerals across dozens of acres, up the rise to other, seemingly separate stems that line the rocky outcrops where water is hard to find. So what is she describing here? She's describing, well, first of all, she notices these slashes, right, up on one trunk, right, the cryptic writing of bears. But then she also emphasizes that there haven't been bears in this area for a long time, which means these trees are very old. They've been around for so long, is what she's noting, right, the age of these trees. And then she looks at the roots of the trees, and she notices how the The roots are these conduits, right, that conduct water from one river, right, from one rivulet, basically over dozens of acres, right, and over into a rocky outcropping where water is hard to find. So she's noticing the way the tree's roots very intelligently seem to connect these vast areas. If we keep reading, she's gonna make more of this idea of connection here. At the height of the rise is a little clearing, slashed down with a chainsaw. Someone has been out improving things. Right, a nice little bit of irony there. She produces her loop from her keychain and applies it to one stump to estimate the number of rings. The oldest down trees are about 80 years. She smiles at the number, so comical, for these 50,000 baby trees all around her have sprouted from a rhizome mass too old to date even to the nearest 100 millennia. Underground, the 80-year-old trunks are 100,000 if they're a day. She wouldn't be surprised if this great, joined, single, clonal creature that looks like a forest has been around for the better part of 1,000,000 years. So what she's noting is that, when you do the sort of analysis of the rings of a tree, you could say, this tree is 80 years old. And for her, that's a comically small number that misrepresents the age of this, what she sees as one single organism, what she describes as a rhizome, right? A great joined single clonal creature that looks like a forest. And so what's important here is Patricia is essentially realizing that all of these trees are connected by their roots underground, and they're not separate species or separate individuals. They are really one great rhizomatic mass that is all connected at the roots. She's recognizing the interconnectedness of these trees to the point that we shouldn't even think of them as multiple separate trees, but as one great organism that has been here for 1,000,000 years. Again, think of the opening passage, how Powers wants us in this novel to think from the point of view of trees, right? At the speed of wood. Well, this is another example of that. Patricia is thinking about the trees through their context, right? Thinking about the trees from their perspective. And how to them, they are part of this organism connected underground at the roots that is 1,000,000 years old, older than anything humans could conceive. That's a very profound passage, I think, in which we see this scientist experiencing this very dramatic and mystical and transcendent connection to the trees, which, of course, so many of these characters experience in different ways and in varying degrees. Another group of characters who experience something similar to this, a moment like this, let's look at the passage where Olivia and Nick basically climb one of the trees in the middle of the novel. This is after they've kind of met, and, Nick has sort of fallen for Olivia, right? And this is when, she is now an environmental activist, and they're essentially trying to protect this tree. So they climb the tree, right, because they want to prevent it, right, from being cut down. So let's take a look at this scene where, the important thing here is that the view they get from the top of the tree is dramatically different from what they see from the ground. And because of that, they have this, especially Nicholas, right, who's really the point of view character here, has this pretty profound inner transformation. I think this is important because what's literally happening, right, is that he is quite literally seeing the world, seeing the earth, not from his human perspective now, but from the perspective of a tree, right? From the point of view of, the top of a tree. And it totally transforms him and how he sees the world. And again, to reiterate, this is what Powers wants us to do as he tells us this story, as he narrates and dramatizes these characters' experiences. This is on page 263, right? Gotten to the top of the tree, at the very bottom. Light gathers in speckled fistfuls on his face. He has slept almost not at all, but rises refreshed in a way normally reserved for the industrious. He rolls onto his side and lifts the tarp. The whole spectrum streams in, from blues to browns, greens to absurd golds. Look at that. Right, so they've slept in the tree at night, is the idea, and now they're waking up. Let's see. Her voice, sleepy but eager, breathes in his ear. Oh, goodness. They look together, high-wire surveyors of a newfound land. The view cracks open his chest. Cloud, mountain, world tree, and mist. All the tangled, rich stability of creation that gave rise to words to begin with, leave him stupid and speechless. Reiterated trunks grow out of Mimas's main line, shooting up parallel like fingers of a Buddha's upraised hand, recouping the mother tree on smaller scales, repeating the inborn shape again and again, their branches running into each other, too mazy and fused to trace. So let's break that down, right? The first key line, I think, is this phrase, newfound land. Right, again, America is so important in this novel, right? The United States, but America as a continent. So I think he wants us to imagine that the two of them, right, Olivia and Nicholas, they are like explorers arriving and seeing America for the first time, seeing a newfound land. And how does he react? Well, obviously it says the view cracks open his chest, but the next line is key. He starts listing these words for what he sees: cloud, mountain, world tree, mist. But the point is, all of the, the creation right before him that gave rise to these words, it leaves him stupid and speechless. The idea is that there are no words for what he's feeling, right? That nature is more powerful than words. This is an important theme for Powers. He's going to come back to this, especially when we read that section from Ray and Dorothy. He's constantly contrasting, right, the story that nature tells to the stories that humans tell throughout this novel, right? Part of this larger meta-commentary that Powers is making about storytelling itself. And Nicholas is kind of experiencing that here, right? Words are failing him. Words are leaving him. He feels like the words are insufficient to describe what he's seeing. The other important description here is comparing the trees to the fingers of a Buddha's upraised hand. Again, that spiritual aspect and spiritual dimension, right, to nature is really important. If we keep reading, fog coats the canopy. Through an opening in Mimas's crown, Mimas, by the way, is the name of the tree. Through an opening in Mimas's crown, the tufted spires of nearby trunks stand swirled in the gauze of a Chinese landscape. There's more substance to the grayish puffs than there is to the green-brown spikes poking through them. All around them spreads a phantasmagoric Ordovician fairy tale. It's morning like the morning when life first came up on dry land. So Ordovician, right, it's this reference to it's a period of the Paleozoic era, right, roughly 45 million years ago. And he's saying the view here makes them feel as though they've gone back to those prehistoric times. Like he says, morning like the morning when life first came up on dry land, when aquatic life first came up to dry land. And the idea is that's what this morning looks like. Again, think of the previous paragraph. He compared it to a newfound land, right? The idea that they are like the first explorers arriving at the Americas. Now he's going back even further. They are like the first land-based creatures. They are like the first creatures to step onto dry land. And that's how powerful this vision is for them, and for Nicholas specifically. If we keep reading, Watchman sweeps back another wall of tarp along its rope runner and looks up. Watchman, by the way, is Nicholas's activist name, basically, his tree name, so to speak. And Olivia is referred to as Maidenhair. Dozens more feet of Mimas unfold above. Trunks that took over when lightning clipped this one. The top of the tangled system disappears into low cloud. Fungi and lichen everywhere, like splatters of paint from a heavenly can. Again, that reference to heavenly, the divine. Powers returns to so many times, right? These characters' experience of nature and of the forest is divine, is heavenly, is spiritual. He and Maidenhair perch most of the way up the Flatiron building. He looks down. The floor of the forest is a dollscape a little girl might make out of acorns and ferns. His legs go cold with thoughts of plummeting. He lowers the tarp. She's staring at him, madness in her hazel eyes that spills out as cackling. We're here. We made it. This is where they want us. Now, the they Olivia is referring to is the trees, right? The idea is Olivia feels as if they have to do what the trees want. The trees are guiding them. She looks like someone summoned to help the most wondrous products of 4 billion years of life. Here and there, solo spires rise above the giant's chorus. They look like green thunderheads or rocket plumes. From below, the tallest neighbors read like mid-sized incense cedars. Only now, 70 yards above the ground, can Nicholas gauge the true size of these few old ones, 5 times larger than the largest whale. So again, he's, comparing the trees, the vision he sees, to all these different things he knows from the world, right? The Flatiron Building, which is meant to be a slightly comical description, thunderheads, rocket plumes, whales, and all of them, the idea is all of them are insufficient. You might say, oh, Powers is mixing his metaphors and images here. No, the point is Nicholas is sort of cycling through all the different things he can think of, all the things that this reminds him of, and none of them are enough. None of them are sufficient. He has to keep cycling through more and more metaphors, comparisons, analogies, descriptions. Continuing on, giants march down into the ravine the 3 of them climbed last night. In the middle distance, the forest broadens into denser, deeper blue. He has read about these trees and their fog. On every side, trees lap at the low, wet sky, the clouds they themselves have helped to seed. Skeins of aerial needles, knobbier and more gnarled, a different thing from the smooth shoots growing at ground level, sip the fog banks, condensing water vapor and sieving it down the sluices of twigs and branches. Again, think of how every time he describes nature, it's an active verb, right? The skeins of aerial needles sip the fog banks. They condense the water vapor. They sieve it down. Nature is active. The trees are active. All of these verbs are active verbs of things that the needles and the trees and the branches are doing. Nick glances upstairs into the kitchen, where their own water catchment system works away, running droplets into a bottle. What struck him as ingenious last night, water for nothing, turns crude compared to the tree's invention. So he looks at their own they've made this makeshift camp in the tree, in the canopy, to basically get this water, right? To get this water from the trees. And he feels like his human invention is crude, right? Again, he's comparing the human to the trees, and he's saying the trees are far smarter and more ingenious than human beings are. Human beings' kind of artificial mechanistic systems seem crude. So one more paragraph here, which I think concludes all of this very nicely. Nicholas watches the drama as if thumbing an infinite flipbook. Again, think of that flipbook from the beginning, from the opening chapter, the stack of pages, the stack of photos. The land unfolds ridge beyond ridge. His eyes adjust to the Baroque abundance. Forests of 5 different shades bathe in the mist, each one a biome to creatures still to be discovered. And every tree he looks on belongs to a Texas financier who has never seen a redwood, but means to gut them all to pay off the debt he took on to acquire them. So the passage ends with this pretty bleak, right? We move from this dramatic, glamorous, mystical, transcendent vision of nature to the bleakness of property, the bleakness of property ownership, of capitalism. And how can you read that passage and not feel just this sense of pure distaste for the human idea of property ownership and acquisition? The idea that these wondrous creations are owned by a Texas financier, right? What an ugly word, the word financier. An ugly word compared to the beauty of all of this natural abundance that Nicholas had noted. Think of what Nicholas must be feeling here, how furious, right? We are of course, this is a story about the development of these activists, right? The sort of way these characters connect with and experience nature and as a result kind of change on the inside. And Nicholas is experiencing this change here. And why is he experiencing it and how is he experiencing it? I mean, he already feels this way, of course. He already has committed, right, to some extent, to this life of activism. But it's confirmed here. It's confirmed because he is up in the tree and he is viewing the world from a new perspective, from a perspective that he has never seen or experienced before, right? A newfound land, as if he is the creature coming up to land from water, one of the first land-based creatures. And the section sort of ends with him returning to the reason he is here, to stop these trees from being gutted, right, by this man who claims to own them. So another passage I want to look at now, so this is now towards the end of the novel, right? And this is that section I noted earlier in which the story of Ray and Dorothy, it's that human drama, right? Where Ray becomes sick and basically Dorothy now reads out loud to Ray, right? And they're basically working their way through a list titled The 100 Greatest Novels of All Time. And we have this description of the books that they read together, right? The books that she reads out loud to them. So this is at the bottom of page 382. The books diverge and radiate, as fluid as finches on isolated islands. But they share a core so obvious it passes for given. Everyone imagines that fear and anger, violence and desire, rage laced with the surprise capacity to forgive. Character is all that matters in the end. It's a child's creed, of course, just one small step up from the belief that the creator of the universe would care to dole out sentences like a judge in federal court. To be human is to confuse a satisfying story with a meaningful one, and to mistake life for something huge with two legs. No, life is mobilized on a vastly larger scale, and the world is failing precisely because no novel can make the contest for the world seem as compelling as the struggles between a few lost people. So it's such an incredible passage, and it reinforces what I said earlier, where even though these sections of the story are narrated from different characters' points of view, right? This is told from Ray's point of view. Powers as a narrator is really the one who is telling this section, because this is not Ray's thinking. This is not what Ray thinks. This reflection on how novels are inadequate because they focus too much on the human, right? This is Powers. This is Powers editorializing, essentially, and telling us that, the idea here is that Ray, he finds comfort in fiction. He likes listening to these novels, right? The rest of this section really emphasizes that, even though he knows it's fiction, they bring him comfort and solace. And Powers is aware of that, of course. He is a fiction writer himself. Powers is sympathetic to that even. He portrays Ray's need to hear these stories as really profound and moving. But he makes sure that we understand that these human stories are not the story that matters, at least not to Powers. I mean, let's look at that paragraph. First of all, he does this very fascinating thing where he compares the books to finches on isolated islands. I mean, that is unmistakably a reference to the Galapagos and to Charles Darwin. He wants us to connect these books to the natural world. He wants us to kind of think of them in the context of evolution, right? The evolution of nature, the way nature moves and transforms. And he's essentially saying that, the books, they might be diverse, they might radiate, they might diverge, but they have this common core, which is that they all believe that character is all that matters in the end. And he calls it a child's creed. Now, this is fascinating because, this is towards the end of the Overstory, right? This is not the very end, but it's towards the end. It's near what we might think of as these climactic sections. This is after Olivia has died, right? After the the activists have failed, basically. And, we, as readers, might be drawn to the characters of the Overstory, right? I certainly was invested in Olivia's story, and her death was quite profound and moving. And it's sort of like Powers is also speaking to us. He is telling us, okay, you, the readers of this novel, don't forget that character is not the only thing that matters. In other words, he's reminding us that even though he is telling us this story, right, so this passage is speaking to us on a metatextual level that goes beyond the scene in which it appears. He is speaking to us and telling us that, yes, even though you might be moved by the characters that I have created, Olivia and Nicholas and Adam and Mimi and Douglas and all of these people whose stories we have been following, right? Even though you might be moved by all of them, that is not what matters in the end. What matters, and he says here, life is mobilized on a vastly larger scale than human beings, meaning the trees, meaning nature, meaning all of the depictions of life that we have seen. Think of that passage where Patricia recognized, right? Patricia Westerford recognized that the trees have this connection deep below the surface, this rhizomatic connection that goes way beyond, right, the 80 years that they might be aged, right? That is a million years old. That, to Powers, is life, right? It's a vastly larger scale. Life is what Nicholas saw from the top of the tree as he looked out. Life is what each of these characters have experienced when they connect with trees, when they connect with the natural world. And then he ends by saying, the world is failing precisely because no novel can make the contest for the world seem as compelling as the struggles between a few lost people. Now that is fascinating because I think that is Powers' challenge to himself. So he's making the statement, but I think we can read it and wonder, well, okay, what about this novel? Can this novel make the world, right? Can this novel make the contest for the world seem as compelling as the struggles between a few lost people? And I believe it does. As a reader, I certainly believe it does. And I believe this little statement here is Powers' ironic challenge to himself. He's not going to go so far as to say his novel is different than other novels, but that is essentially what he's saying, right? He's saying this novel, my way of writing, my view of fiction is different because I see the world and I don't get lost in individual human dramas and human lives. And, you know, as readers, we might not agree with that, right? Many of us, and I mean, certainly I love the human dramas. That's the meat of so much literature is the human dramas. So many of the novels that we've discussed on this podcast have been human dramas, right? Stefan Zweig's The Burning Secret, right, moved me so much because it was about a human drama, right? The human consciousness awakening. But of course, I also recognize that Powers is right here, right? That even though I am, like Ray and like all of these characters, even though I am moved by the human tragedies and the human dramas, Powers is challenging me and readers like me to recognize that there is something greater at stake. There is the contest for the world, as in nature, as in climate change, as in the destruction of the environment, as in the trees. And it's really moving to read this and to think, you know what, he's right. And maybe, and we're going to see when we get to the end of this novel, maybe he succeeds with his novel at going beyond the human, which of course would be fitting because he is so often criticized as a writer, right, by people like James Wood for being inhuman. And here he takes that idea and turns it on his head and says, well, maybe in this world that we live in, the human is not enough. Maybe we need to transcend the human. And when we look at the end of this novel, we will ask ourselves the question, do we think he transcends the human successfully at the end? So let's look at the very end then. Let's look at the ending of the novel. And again, one thing I want to note is I have skipped so many big and key passages, so many moments, right? We've barely talked about Mimi. We've barely talked about Douglas. We've barely talked about Nile. There's so many major characters who we have simply not discussed because there is too much to discuss. And this is the beauty of reading a novel, right? When I decided to do this novel for this podcast and kind of broke down which sections, which chapters will I read, do I think are the most significant, these are the ones that I chose. Other people might have totally different passages that they would select. Maybe you read this novel and it's actually Adam's character who you connect with the most, right? Or Nile's character. That's, I think, the power of these multi-point of view, multi-perspective, multi-protagonist novels, is that there is so much richness in them. And everyone reading them can read them in different ways. Let's look at the ending, though. Let's look at two passages. Let's look at two passages from the ending. So first, on page 493, so towards the end, this is in the section titled Seeds. So I want us to look at this moment of sort of new understanding, new revelation from Nick. Nick is still an activist, right? He's still working to try and draw attention to this. Only now he's successfully using his artistic skills as well. He's essentially creating these installations in the woods. So let's look at this section here where he's, we see him basically working with people to create part of this installation. From nowhere, in a heartbeat, Nick understands what Maidenhair's voices must always have meant. The most wondrous products of 4 billion years of life need help. Not them, us. Help from all quarters. So this is Nick's big revelation, right? That line earlier about the products of 4 billion years of life, the wondrous products, he thought that was a reference to the trees. No, he realizes, it's about human beings. Humans are the ones who need help, not the trees. That's the revelation that he reaches at the end of the novel. They are the ones who are in danger of dying. The idea here is that the trees will be fine, because the trees will find a way, because they have always found a way, because they are older than us and wiser than us, they have survived longer than us, and they will survive again. The implication of the ending of Powers' novel here is that the trees can speak to each other, can communicate with each other, and as a result can sort of live and survive without us. We, human beings, are the ones who need help. And that's sort of, I think, the lesson that Powers wants his activist characters to learn at the end, right? They believed they were working to save the trees, but they were really working to try and save themselves. That's the revelation that Nicholas reaches here at the end. So then if we look at one of the next sections, if we jump ahead a little bit, and again, the ending here, I just want to say the ending to the Overstory is so complex, so many different threads weaving together. We're not going to be able to touch on them all. I want to look, though, at Mimi, who we haven't really talked about Mimi, but the key revelation that she has, right? She's sitting in Mission Dolores Park at the very end, and she basically begins to essentially hear the trees. She begins to understand what the trees are saying. Let's look at this section. This is on page 499. Down at the bottom. Messages hum from out of the bark she leans against. Chemical semaphores home in over the air. Currents rise from the soil-gripping roots, relayed over great distances through fungal synapses, linked up in a network the size of the planet. The signals say, a good answer is worth reinventing from scratch again and again. They say, the air is a mix we must keep making. They say, there's as much below ground as above. They tell her, do not hope or despair or predict or be caught surprised. Never capitulate, but divide, multiply, transform, conjoin, do, and endure as you have all the long day of life. There are seeds that need fire, seeds that need freezing, seeds that need to be swallowed, etched in digestive acid, expelled as waste, seeds that must be smashed open before they'll germinate. A thing can travel everywhere just by holding still. So what is the message that Mimi gets from the trees? She basically gets this message about seeds, right? This idea that, there are lots of ways that seeds can germinate. Some need fire, some need to be swallowed in digestive acid, some need to be expelled as waste, some need to be smashed. But the point is, the seeds can accomplish all of this. How? Well, they can travel everywhere just by holding still. So the lesson, right, and this is a lesson a lot of the characters learn in different contexts and different ways, the lesson that Mimi learns is you need to hold still. And what does that mean? Well, think of the opening. Think of that first passage we read. The speed of wood, right? The speed of wood. The message that the trees are giving the human characters at the end is that the human characters need to slow down and need to experience and live life at the speed of trees, at the speed of wood, at the time scale of these vast forests. And it's perfect because let's look at the very end then. The final scene, the final section is Nick. We go back to him and the logs that he's arranging, and we see, well, what is he designing here? What is he creating? What kind of artistic sculpture, what artistic piece is he creating, out in the forest? The transported pieces of downed wood snake through the standing trees. Satellites high up above this work already take pictures from orbit. The shapes turn into letters complete with tendril flourishes, and the letters spell out a gigantic word legible from space. Still. So that is the word that Nick and his friends create. That is the sculpture, essentially, the artistic piece that they have created. That word has so many meanings, right? It obviously means what the trees were telling Mimi, to be still, right? To stay still. So it's a counsel of patience. It's a way of counseling patience. It also, I think, conveys this sense of endurance, as in, we are still here, we are still alive, there is still a chance, right? So it conveys this sense of continuation, of survival. And I think the word has this double meaning, and that's why it's so profound here. But then also think about the way Nick has written this word. He has taken trees, right? He has taken these pieces of downed wood to create this message. He is literally using trees and arranging them to spell out an English word that humans can understand. He is accomplishing the thing, right, that they have struggled to accomplish, to communicate between trees and humans, right? He is trying to connect the language of the trees to the words of human beings. Remember earlier when he was standing up at the top of the tree and looking down, it was described as, he was so moved that words were failing him. He was trying out all sorts of different comparisons and metaphors and getting nowhere. Now, this is the culmination of Nick's arc. He has understood how to connect words and nature through this word still, using the downed wood of trees. If we keep reading, let's just read the end here because I think it's quite profound. The learners will puzzle over the message that springs up there, so near to the methane-belching tundra. But in the blink of a human eye, the learners will grow connections. Already this word is greening. Already the mosses surge over, the beetles and lichen and fungi turning the logs to soil. Already seedlings root in the nurse log's crevices, nourished by the rot. So Powers is describing the different living creatures and natural things that will kind of take over these logs, right? The lichen, the beetles, the fungi, they will turn it green, right? The letters that spell out still, they will turn it green. Soon new trunks will form the word in their growing wood, following the cursive of these decaying mounds. 2 centuries more, and these 5 living letters too will fade back into the swirling patterns, the changing rain and air and light. And yet, but still, they'll spell out, for a while, the word life has been saying since the beginning. So, just a profound kind of passage there where he's essentially suggesting and implying that Nick has successfully communicated to the trees. He has taught them the word that they have taught him in his language, right? That the trees will basically form the word in their growing wood, kind of following, right, the letters that Nick has spelled out on the ground. It'll take centuries, but these 5 living letters will fade back into the swirling patterns of the natural world. I mean, it's so beautiful and profound what he's saying at the end there, that this is the word that the trees and that nature has been trying to teach to human beings, right? The word life has been saying since the beginning, still, right? And it has that double meaning: stay still, stay calm, be at the speed of wood, but also still, yet, nevertheless. This word that implies continuation. We are still alive. We are still here. And I just find it to be such a profound way to end this novel on essentially what is communication, successful communication between trees and human beings. That Nick, through this work of art, inspired by Maidenhair, right, inspired by Olivia and his experience, right, with all the activists, right, that this word, Nick uses this word to communicate with the trees. And it's such a beautiful kind of a way to conclude this novel. There's a few more passages here, but I think we'll just end there because I think that idea, the word still, the word that nature has been trying to teach to us, I think that's a perfect place to end, and a great way to reflect on kind of the profound nature of this novel, of this story. Again, the reason I think this novel, The Overstory, is one of the great works of the 21st century, it speaks directly to our time period. Like all of the novels we have read and looked at, they all have some relationship to the time period in which they were written. That's what makes a novel profound. That's what makes a novel great. Yes, we want novels to be universal, and we have read some universal novels, but universality often comes from the relationship you have to the particularities of your time. And for our time, climate change and environmental destruction is a very real thing and a very frightening thing for a lot of people. Something that can give a lot of us deep levels of anxiety. But Powers is suggesting here is how we transcend this. Here is how we move through this. Here is a story of human beings struggling in the way humans do and learning something through this profound connection to nature. Not just learning something, but also, at the end, successfully speaking to nature, successfully communicating with nature. And that's, I think, a very, very profound way of speaking to the issues of the 21st century. All right, so we'll end there. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being here. And yeah, as always, if you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast, and I will see you all next time.